still only addressing the tip of the iceberg. At the UN Statistical Commission last month, March, we reached an important milestone when the international recommendations on statelessness statistics were adopted. And we will be hearing more about what that means for addressing statelessness shortly. With this event, we're looking to achieve 5 objectives. First, we want to raise awareness of the need to improve statelessness data through spotlighting the life experiences of stateless persons. Secondly, we want to capitalize on the opportunity of the great audience online and in person of the UN World Data Forum to introduce the international recommendations on statelessness statistics and to encourage its implementation. We will learn from country experiences of producing data on vulnerable populations and stateless persons, and we will showcase perspectives that have been crucial to the development of the statistical standards. We will discuss the potential impact of the recommendations and how they can help develop approaches to solving statelessness and to improving the lives of stateless people. And finally, we will seek to identify opportunities for data innovation and data sources to complement the efforts of national authorities, including attracting partners who can support. That's pretty ambitious, right? But we will endeavor to cover all of that in our session, which has 2 parts. First, we will learn about statelessness from the life experience and grassroots efforts of our guest speaker, Karina Ambartsumian-Clau. Karina is the executive director of United Stateless. United Stateless is a national organization led by stateless people whose mission is to build and inspire a community among those affected by statelessness and to advocate for their human rights. She has experienced statelessness herself, having fled a dissolving Soviet Union with her family in the 1990s. Next, we will move to a panel discussion with 3 distinguished panelists representing the Philippines National Statistical Office, the UN Refugee Agency mandated to address statelessness, and the expert group on Refugee, IDP, and Statelessness Statistics. And I will introduce them after we hear Karina's presentation. A very quick housekeeping note, for the audience online, kindly mute your microphones during the entire session. We hope to be able to take a question or 2 from the audience at the end of the panel discussion, but please bear with us if we don't have time for it. And now, it's my pleasure to pass the floor to Karina for her presentation. Karina, over to you.
Hi there, my name is Karina. I am an executive director and founding member of United Stateless, and I am a stateless person. Next slide, please. A stateless person is a person who is not considered as a national by any state under the operation of its law. Out of all the countries in the world, a stateless person does not meet any of the criteria necessary to qualify for citizenship. Either you were born on territory, a parent is a national, or in some cases you're able to nationalize. A stateless person can do neither. Stateless people are often referred to as citizens of nowhere. Next slide, please. I am, as I mentioned, the executive director. We want to solve the problem of statelessness for those impacted in the United States and give voice to those who have lost their basic human right to a nationality. Next slide, please. I have been stateless practically my entire life. Next, please. I came to the United States. I was born in a country that does not exist anymore, and the country that replaced it does not recognize me as their own. I became stateless in the United States at 8 years old. I came to the United States from what is now Ukraine when I was 8, and after my parents fled the destruction of the former Soviet Union. I am of Armenian and Ukrainian descent. My culture and identity has always rooted me a sense of belonging, where nationality has not. Ukraine does not recognize me as their citizen, neither does Armenia, and definitely not Russia. But I have not been able to been eligible for citizenship in the United States. And I would also discover in my adulthood that even marrying my US citizen husband will not qualify me to become a lawful resident or green card holder. In short, my experience at the time ashamed me. I was embarrassed to be in such a predicament, unable to finish university, unable to obtain work permits, and limited to menial labor to support myself, unable to fully feel independent and felt so many barriers to live to my fullest potential, unable to visit my dying grandmother. I began to learn more about my story, and at the age of 24 years old, I learned to discover statelessness and how different this is from any other immigration status. Yet, I have never met anyone else like me. I began to tell my story more broadly and more openly. Next, please. For 4 years later, in 2018, I connected with a stateless person for the first time over Twitter, a social media platform. We then connected with 5 others, and the 7 of us started United Stateless as the only organization in the United States solely addressing the statelessness in the US. We're also led by those directly impacted, with a majority stateless-led board and myself as the executive director. We continue to thrive. Pictured here is from our 2021 convening. We have more than doubled as a core organization made up of stateless individuals, members of those stateless families, and allies, including those with the expert training behind law, policy, and stakeholders in various fields. Next slide, please. We are on a mission to advocate for policy changes that we desperately need to see, support those directly impacted by lack of nationality, constantly and continuously educating stakeholders, change makers, including the stateless community, what statelessness is. We build a community by identifying stateless people and bringing them into a circle where they find empowerment, their voice, and support with their own legal and social services. We transforming into a hub for resources and knowledge related to statelessness and nationality rights. Next, please. We are doing a lot, and we are working to address an issue that has never been fully addressed in the United States. The US is a country with a birthright citizenship, or jus soli, although statelessness exists here. Next, please. The United States law does not define statelessness for protection or assistance based on being stateless. It is a largely unknown, underreported, and misunderstood issue, even among stateless people. There's no official data from the US government in quantifying statelessness. It is a human rights violation and it causes repeated trauma. In many countries, it's a prelude to atrocities. There are a variety of ways stateless people appear before immigration court, and there are a variety of ways stateless people enter the US and the stories that they tell. Some of us have overstayed our visa. Some of us have failed consular registrations or have a lapse in travel documentation validity. Some of us are completely undocumented, while others were denied asylum and placed under supervision and detained for repeatedly. Some of us were foreign exchange students, while others were resettled as refugees and loss of status due to crime. Statelessness is different from any other immigrant community in the US, as we cannot be deported to any other country. We are in the United States permanently without protections because of our statelessness. Next, please. Being stateless is being denied the right of a legal identity. You have no right to legally work and are susceptible to abuse. You have limited upward mobility, barriers to mental and physical health, prolonged family separations for decades and many indefinitely, repeated and prolonged detention, left unprotected, unable to adjust yet unable to leave. And many of us have the burden of filing taxes, even though we're unable to retrieve some of those benefits when we are eligible. and the continuous criminalization of poverty and collateral consequences of convictions. Being stateless is being denied the right of a legal identity. Often means that people like me are not included in any official data or statistic, making it even more challenging to identify and address their specific needs. Without legal documentation, stateless people may not be able to participate in political processes or access public services and may be vulnerable to exploitation or abuse. We know this because this is a global issue. It is a universal problem that affects people from all backgrounds, ethnicities, and countries. Statelessness exists where states are. States are often perpetuators of statelessness and often the ones responsible to resolve the issue. Regardless of individual circumstances, stateless individuals face similar challenges in accessing basic rights and services worldwide. Next slide, please. Center for Migration Studies conducted a 2-year study to quantify and qualify statelessness in the US. It is a robust first attempt to pull data about stateless people in a country without any stateless legal framework. It is crucial for ensuring that the needs of those impacted by statelessness are recognized and addressed. This is the first ever study published in 2020. Now, a tiny brief note on methodology. The qualitative data method was derived from a convening of stateless experts, including those directly impacted. United Stateless was part of this process. They then developed an online survey, and this part entailed mapping organizations in the US, networking, in some circumstances, interviews. The quantitative method was mostly derived from the American Community Survey, or ACS, and this is a conducted annual survey that gathers social and economic data from 3.5 million US households. They also based on variables in the survey, including country of birth, year of entry, ancestry, and language. These characteristics are also queried foreign-born residents who have not naturalized. And of course, CMS also combined data from 2 other resources. RAPS, which is a data pulled from the US Department of State Refugee Processing Center. A stateless person can be a refugee. And of course from TRACK, which is a different data pool pulled from a different government agency that handles immigration proceedings in immigration court and any appeals that arise. What we have found, in the next slide, please, is that stateless people in the US is like a microcosm of statelessness globally. There are an estimate 200,000 stateless people in the US from over 30 different countries and territories around the world. Just as I mentioned the variety of ways stateless people entered the US, we also capture the variety of themes that made us stateless. Some people are born in a country that has no birthright citizenship. Some people are born as refugees or displaced persons, like those fleeing Ukraine, or those trapped in eastern Ukraine under Russia control, and cannot prove their citizenship, while others are born in countries where they are unable to inherit citizenship from their mothers because of gender discriminatory laws. Some people are from countries that no longer exist, such as the former Soviet Union or Yugoslavia. Some are Holocaust survivors. Next slide, please. This right abuses and systematic issues. It also helps prioritize and allocate resources effectively by identifying the areas with greatest need. In our case, for legal capacity, outreach strategies, especially monitoring the progress of interventions over time. And overall, it is an essential tool for empowerment and advocacy. Next slide, please. We learned to become empowered by our stories. United Stateless, we recognize the momentum that the CMS report generated, and it is a step forward towards building for change. As a community, we are committed to raising awareness and build political momentum for change. Next, please. And I'm proud to share that our efforts have yielded positive results. On December 15, 2021, Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, announced its commitment to, quote, adopt definition of statelessness for immigration purposes and enhance protections for stateless individuals in the United States. This United States government agency has the bandwidth to implement policies short of law reform. Next slide, please. Although, in order to provide a permanent solution, the United States Congress must pass the Stateless Protection Act, which was introduced by Senator Cardin and Representative Raskin in December 2022. The act, if passed, will allow stateless persons to apply for green cards after passing background checks and all other security clearances for applicants. It gives stateless persons the opportunity to work legally. It gives stateless persons the ability to travel and reunite with family or overseas. It allows the United States to meet its responsibility to protect stateless people in its borders. Next slide, please. Impact-led organizations can leverage data to achieve significant human rights victories, but it takes collective effort. Change is possible. It takes all of us. Next, please. And thank you so much for allowing me to speak here today. It's been an honor.
Let's give a hand to Karina. Karina, thank you very much for a personal testimony of that caliber. It really brings very close to us what it means to be a stateless person. And you certainly bring memories to me, having worked with stateless people in the context of ex-Yugoslavia, where I could recognize many of the points and issues that you were highlighting. And kudos to you and the statelessness community that comes together in United Stateless for keeping up the spirit and for really creating that community in a space where isolation prevails. And data is beautiful. I can only attest to that, which sets us up for a great, and thank you for that, Karina, that was kind of the key word we needed, because it sets us up for a good conversation with our panelists as we dive into statelessness definitions, data, and opportunities. So I will now proceed to introduce our panelists. And I will start with Maritza Grande, whom we have here with us in person. Maritza is the Assistant National Statistician of the Civil Registration Service of the Philippine Statistics Authority. She has served as the Division Chief of the Civil Register Management Division. She's a member of various technical working groups and committees on crafting policy issuances of the Civil Registrar General. Maritza is a member of the Regional Steering Group of the CRVS and is also a National CRVS focal point for the CRVS decade 15 to 24. She is also supporting the work of the expert group on Refugee, IDP, and Statelessness Statistics. Welcome, Maritza. Our next panelist is Monica Sandvik, who is joining us online. This is my colleague from UNHCR, who is the Chief of Statelessness Section at the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR. Monica has more than 20 years of experience in international protection and humanitarian affairs, having worked with UNICEF, UN OCHA, and UNHCR in headquarters in Africa, several countries in Africa and in Asia. And finally, and not least, we have Natalia Krinsky-Bal, also online. She is the head of the Secretariat of the Expert Group on Refugee, IDP, and Statelessness Statistics, where she coordinates the work on supporting the implementation of the statistical recommendation of the mentioned population groups. Previously, she was a senior strategy and policy officer at the place that I work at, so World Bank UNHCR Joint Data Center on Forced Displacement. And she's also been the coordinator of the Joint IDP Profiling Service. For the last 10 years, Natalia has been invested in strengthening available data and analysis in forced displacement situations, working very closely with national and international actors, and also taking action for that matter. So as you can see, this is a full woman panel coming at you, so brace yourself for impact. Jokes aside, I would like to start with the first question to Monica. Monica, you lead UNHCR's efforts in preventing, addressing, and ending statelessness globally. As the expert on the subject matter, could you please unpack statelessness for us and tell us why data is important to resolving statelessness? Over to you, Monica.
Thank you, Maya, for that, and I'm very pleased to be on this panel. It's a great honor for me to be here as well, and I really want to congratulate those who have joined this session, because I think when we talk about data around statelessness is essential, and as Karina was saying, data is beautiful, and it's particularly beautiful when we talk about statelessness. Can you move to the next slide, please? So a stateless person is a person who is not considered a national by any law. That was also covered by Karina. Nationality really represents a legal bond between an individual and a state, and I think we often refer to nationality as the right to have rights. You can go to the next slide, please. So why do people become stateless? I think some of these elements were also covered by Karina. It's about discrimination in nationality laws. It can be around minorities, for example. We know that more than 75% of known stateless populations belong to a minority group. Gender discrimination is another element here. There's about 24 countries in the world where women can't pass on nationality to their children at the same level as men can. And I think often when we speak to people who are not so familiar with statelessness, this issue about gender discrimination is something that really strikes with people, and they say that really mothers can't pass on nationality to their children. That must be a mistake, but it still exists in 24 countries, and we are working with partners to reduce that number further. There's also in some countries or contexts where there are gaps between nationality laws, where you are in another country and there's a conflict in terms of nationality legislation between the two laws, and you end up in limbo because of that. Karina's story is really a good example of a story where state succession resulted in statelessness. Lack of birth registration in itself is not it doesn't mean that a person is stateless, but it is really a important risk factor, because with a birth registration and a birth certificate, you can prove links with a state, which is essential for claiming nationality. There are several effects of statelessness. I think we already heard about what the impact is at the individual level. Not able to access education, healthcare, freedom of movement, but also simple things that we all take for granted, like getting a SIM card, for example, or opening a bank account. But I think we're also increasingly seeing that this also has a huge impact on the countries themselves and on communities. It means that people can't work in the formal sector, and therefore are also not able to register to pay taxes. So it really is a direct loss of income for governments. And it can also lead to instability and tension and displacement. And, as we are heading towards 2030, it also means that states won't be able to meet the SDGs, especially the SDG on legal identity for all. Next slide, please. But what is very specific about statelessness is that it is something that is entirely solvable. And many states have already taken steps to address statelessness. Kyrgyzstan, for example, is the only country so far that has been able to declare that they have solved all known cases of statelessness. Kenya has adopted a strategy whereby they have taken one minority group after another to grant them nationality. There are two groups that have already been granted access to nationality, and a third one is in the process with the political statement already being made to that effect. Many states have also taken steps to reform their laws to address gaps. For example, 13 states have introduced safeguards in nationality laws to prevent childhood statelessness. And since 2014, we have 3 states, Sierra Leone, Madagascar, and Liberia, that removed gender discrimination from their nationality laws. Then when we talk about statelessness in more kind of a migratory context, 21 states have established statelessness determination procedures, including the Philippines, which is really important for identifying stateless populations or persons, and then also helping with their processing. And 16 states have taken the next step, which really is also setting up a procedure for facilitated naturalization of stateless migrants. Over to the issue of data, then a few perspectives from my side on that. So what is it that we know currently? So UNHCR keeps track of the stateless population globally, and we have managed to establish that about 4.3 million people around the world are stateless in about 96 countries. So this is a bit of a mix in terms of data, how this is collected. But we know that this is not the full picture. We know that there are many more countries that have stateless populations, but it simply isn't recorded. So we think that the true number is significantly higher, maybe in 10 million or even 50 million has been quoted. We only have data from about half of the countries. So there is significant gaps. And I think in sub-Saharan Africa, only about 7 countries are reporting data on statelessness. What we also see is that the numbers don't change. They stay static. They don't change from year to year. So it's really just repeating the same numbers. We also have really a lack of demographic breakdown of data. We don't know how many men and women are impacted. We don't know how many children are impacted. And there's also a huge population of people with undetermined nationality status. And also another gap is the limited socioeconomic data in terms of knowing how this is impacting on communities, on individuals when it comes to their financial situation, and also how it is impacting on states. Over to the next slide, please. I think I will actually go over to the next one, just in the interest of time. So some of the efforts that have been taken to address data gaps. So we have a number of household surveys where selected stateless populations have been included. We have an important household survey that was done between the World Bank and UNHCR in Kenya that was really showing the importance or the socioeconomic impact of statelessness on the Shona population, for example. A number of countries have also included questions regarding statelessness in their censuses. For example, Cote d'Ivoire is one of those countries. In some countries also, stateless communities also do self-registration. So this has been an important effort also, again, in Kenya, where the Shona community has done their own self-registration exercises, and that is now helping them when they are on process of being naturalized. Through the EGRISS work and the IROSS work that we are going to speak about today, we've also seen the cooperation with regional bodies and national statistical institutions as being really essential. I think one thing that we are also learning is the importance of linking up with stateless communities, also when it comes to data. When we don't have data, I think that is the starting point in order to try to reach out to these communities and work with them also to improve data. And then finally, I mean, we are so excited about the adoption of IROSS in March this year, because we really think that this is a milestone for work on statelessness, as it really will systematize and the collection of data on statelessness. So it is essential, and I'm really excited to hear the next speaker speak about IROSS. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. That was quite a comprehensive summary of something extremely complex, and just pulling from all the experiences globally, you show how many different faces statelessness has. And super to hear about the solutions and that in fact it's not difficult, right? But we do need the data. And the data is, we talk about stateless people as the most vulnerable of the vulnerable, but this is compounded by the fact that they're probably the most data poor population globally. So thank you for that. It gives me a natural segue to Maritza, who will give us a national perspective in this regard. Please come up with me, Maritza.
Thank you, Maya, and good afternoon, everyone, to our participants here on site and, of course, those participating online.
Thank you, Maritza. And let me give you the question that I have for you. So in the Philippines, you have been very active on the statelessness front. Please share with us what opportunities and challenges related to including stateless persons in your national statistical systems you encounter. We're very interested to hear how the challenges have been addressed in your context, and especially how your involvement in EGRISS, the expert group, and the development of the international recommendations on statelessness statistics has impacted the efforts in the Philippines.
Okay, thank you. I think there are a lot of opportunities in the case of our country in relation to including stateless persons in the national statistical systems, given the recommendations of the IROSS. So let me just highlight some of the opportunities that we had in our country. We have a very strong national coordinating mechanism through the Interagency Steering Committee, or the IASC, consisting of 17 government agencies, and this is being chaired by the Department of Justice, with the UNHCR Philippines acting as an interim secretariat. So this IASC is supported with the 7 National Action Plan technical working groups, and we are part of the NAP Action 7, which is improving the quantitative and qualitative data on stateless persons. This is being led by DOJ, co-chaired by the PSA. And another NAPTWG on ensuring birth registration for the prevention of statelessness, which is also PSA's co-lead. So we have also recently the Republic Act 10625, which established or created the Philippine Statistics Authority, and provided a legal framework for the creation of interagency committees by the PSA board at a national level, to coordinate and resolve agency and sectoral concerns on statistical matters. Then we also created subnational level IACs. This is being done aimed at monitoring and implementing strategies and programs for the achievement of not only for the CRBS decade, but also for the SDG goals. And finally, we'd like to inform that the country uses an interagency approach, whole of government approach, and including the society to ensure the realization of on the access to rights and services of the stateless or the persons of concern. And having said that, the head of the PSA, who is our national statistician and civil registrar general, is mandated since we are the central repository, the central statistical authority. We are also mandated to implement the civil registration law, the national identification system, the community-based monitoring system. So having said that, the data can be derived from one agency, well, of course, taking into consideration data sharing on privacy and also confidentiality issues. So I think I would like to mention some notable milestones with regards to the stateless that PSA's initiative, which is the inclusion of the persons of concerns or stateless persons in the national identification system. So we have revised the policies and guidelines for the manual for PhilSys to include the persons of concern in lieu of the valid foreign passport by the POCs, the certificate of recognition or the notice of recognition that will be issued by the Department of Justice, Refugees and Stateless Protection Unit for refugees and stateless persons, or even the certificate of pending application issued by the DOJ for asylum seekers and stateless applicants will be accepted. And this is already, the current status is for approval. And then for the implementation of the PhilSys birth registration project, we have this to cover unregistered Filipinos nationwide, 3.7 million, of which we have 2 objectives. One is to register the birth certificate and also to enroll them in the Philippine identification system. So primarily, the objective of this project is to cover those belonging in the marginalized communities, such as the indigenous peoples, Muslim Filipinos, those in the poorest sector, and those who were born in other places but currently residing in the locality. So data is beautiful, so I would like to share that as of April 20, we have already the list of 1.2 million submitted by our local civil registrars nationwide, of which 900,000 plus have resulted to a negative verification, which means they don't have a birth certificate. And this is for the delayed registration process with the local civil registrars. So with regards to the challenges, we have also some list in the recent 2020 census of populations. Other persons of concern or stateless persons are not covered. I think the Samabajais are the one included because of unclear concept in the data gathering per stateless person. So technical guidance on framework, the concepts, the operational definition of statelessness is needed to be discussed in the interagency committees involved, because this is for approval of the PSA board, and we need to have a work program since it involves several services in the PSA. We are also set to conduct the mid-decade census by 2025. Another one, the set of questions for stateless persons data. If there are too many and considered that it is a large-scale operation, and it should be completed within a month in our country, is very expensive, as additional questions in the census have implications on the cost. So PSA also need to discuss other collection methods to measure data on statelessness persons, such as through administrative data. So another one I think is that some populations may not be aware that they are at a risk of statelessness. You know, as mentioned a while ago, if you have no birth record, you could be at risk of statelessness. So it could pose a challenge in terms of the data collection. Data collection per statelessness, especially in geographically isolated and disadvantaged areas, or also included the migratory settings, is also a challenge for us. And also, we'd like to post on how we can reach out those at risk of stateless persons outside its Philippine territory, for example, in the undocumented Filipinos in Sabah. Although there's a current special consular mission that is being conducted in palm plantations in Sabah. So these are some of the challenges. And I think another one, we don't have yet the centralized database. We are in the process of working with the data management group for the establishment of a data management system for possible data sharing between or among government agencies on statelessness data. That's a very long challenges, I think.
But that's great. Did you have something else on that you wanted to add, or do you want to save it for the next question?
Okay. Okay. I'd like to add also that how did we address these challenges? We are currently reviewing the EGRISS recommendation and statelessness on how we can capture in the next census, as I've mentioned a while ago, the mitigate census by 2025. And we are reviewing the concept and methodology for the possible inclusion. But in the meantime, absent the data on the census, but we have partial in the in the 2020 census of population. But absent the data in the census, we are constantly coordinating with the IASC and the National Action Plan Technical Working Group to have the number of the persons of concern and stateless persons updated. So we do have quarterly meetings on this. Okay, thank you.
Super. Thank you very much, Maritza. So it sounds to me as if the recommendations on statelessness statistics don't come a minute too soon vis-a-vis the census that you're looking at. And it's great to hear, you know, the very diverse measures that you're taking in Philippines to both prevent and address statelessness. And I can see that the work in EGRISS is having a connection to you, and that it is meaningful. Maybe we can also hear from Natalia in a moment on how some of the issues around questionnaires can be addressed in, again, talking about cost and so on. So indeed, Natalia, let me turn to you. My question to you is, please tell us how the international recommendations on statelessness statistics work, and we would also like to hear about the work more broadly of EGRISS, how it supports countries to improve data on statelessness persons. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Maya. And it was great to listen to the presentation from Karina and the interventions of the previous two panelists. It's a topic that has, with every day over the past couple of years, become closer and closer to my heart. I've been working much more on forced displacement statistics, as you highlighted in my bio earlier in your introduction, but much more in the more recent years, I've been focusing more and more on the very tricky issues around statelessness data in many contexts. But thank you for the question. I want to, if it's okay, to take the two parts of the question separately. So to first speak a little bit about, at least from my perspective in EGRISS, how the IROSS themselves can help, and then separately to speak a little bit about the work of EGRISS that we hope will also kind of catalyze and further support the implementation of the recommendation. So I'll speak briefly in two parts. On the first question, so how can the IROSS support, and building on Monica's brief mention of them, but also the experience shared by Maritza in the Philippines, and the expectation that she highlighted forward-looking about how they can be useful in her specific national context. I would like to kind of take us up to the global level and try to summarize a little bit more broadly about how I believe that the IROSS can help. I believe it can support countries and, of course, other stakeholders. This is primarily, of course, about national statistics, but it's not only national partners that are involved in their production. In many other contexts, there are very important roles for international community and civil society to also play. But the IROSS can really support the improvement of statelessness data in official statistical systems in three main ways. Firstly, by providing a framework that can help define stateless and related populations. Secondly, by providing recommended statistics. So what statistics should be produced, which questions do we need to ask, that can help inform effective national policy and inclusion in development frameworks, the inclusion of stateless persons in development frameworks. And thirdly, by guiding countries and their partners on how to adapt existing data sources. We just heard about the Philippines' upcoming census, but of course, importantly, existing coordination mechanisms that are in place in various national contexts. So on the first point, the provision of a framework, the IROSS really represent the first time there has been an internationally endorsed framework for how to define stateless persons for statistical purposes. Of course, there is a pre-existing, and we heard from Monica, well-recognized legal framework, but we all know that legal definitions don't necessarily directly translate in statistical definitions. So there was work that was needed and has now been achieved with the IROSS to produce this framework that countries and other stakeholders can use. So the first point is really critical, given the large variety of ways, as we heard from Karina and Monica, that people can become stateless. It will help, a common framework can help produce more comparable statistics. And of course, comparable statistics requires an alignment of different classifications. Otherwise, we're left comparing apples and oranges, as the saying goes. It's also really important, given the huge political sensitivities that surround this topic in so many contexts, to have internationally agreed statistical definitions, so they can more neutrally and in a more technically, if you like, be brought into discussions that might otherwise be too politically sensitive to discuss at the level of kind of statistical practice. So second, the recommendations provide not only help define these population groups, but they also provide recommended statistics, i.e. what statistics need to be produced, what are the indicators, what are the vulnerabilities that should ideally be monitored and evaluated. This is really important because it takes the conversation beyond data production towards data impact. What are the policy areas that most affect stateless persons? What are their key vulnerabilities? What data should be monitored to support their inclusion in development frameworks, whether those be national development frameworks, SDGs, or the rest? And the IROSS has taken the approach here, both looking at the Stateless Convention itself and the rights outlined and recognized internationally that stateless persons should have. But it also, as we are in the era of the Sustainable Development Goals, looks very practically at this indicator framework to also identify kind of priority indicators within the SDG framework that are most pertinent for stateless populations. Third, the IROSS helps by guiding countries in a more kind of practical and operational sense in terms of the adaptation of existing data sources and coordination mechanisms. And this is essential. It complements the more normative, higher level, some may say theoretical aspects that are more that I've mentioned just previously, to provide very practical, hands-on technical guidance on specific data sources and specific coordination functions. In this regard, the recommendations consider, on the one hand, traditional data sources, census, surveys, administrative data. They also look at non-governmental data, citizen-generated data, other types of alternative data sources, and of course highlight the critical role of data integration techniques. So making use of existing data better and exploring how different data sources can be integrated to produce better data on stateless persons, as we just heard Maritza mention in the context of the Philippines. The latter is really essential because in many contexts, we're talking about relatively small population groups, right? It might not be economical, it might not be possible to launch, independent survey series for this population in particular. So it really is about making better use of existing data and kind of integrating or adapting existing data sources to improve what they can produce to help identify stateless persons. On the other hand, the recommendations also provide concrete guidance for both national, they look at kind of national coordination structures. They also look at the critical role that regional coordination can play to really advance this agenda in particular regional contexts. And make very kind of concrete, or they aim to make very concrete recommendations as how these can be facilitated and look at examples of good practice in recent years. So for these three reasons, we hope that IROSS will be a game changer in global efforts to improve data on statelessness. They were developed collaboratively with input from over 51 countries at different stages of the process. And so I can say quite strongly that they quite confidently that they reflect the perspective and build on experiences of member states. And we hope in this regard that they can also be more useful and more welcomed by a larger number of member states who are also interested in working on this topic. Having said this, I am fully aware that recommendations and any guidance, tools, publications, they're really only worth the paper they're written on, unless they're accompanied by complementary efforts and stakeholders working together and identifying how they can be used in practice. So I'm not here to say that the IROSS themselves are the magic wands, but to say that they are really an important contribution to advancing this agenda. And this is where the second part of my answer comes in, and where I'd like to say just a few words about the work of EGRISS in response to your question about how we're hoping to support the implementation of IROSS and support countries to improve their data on stateless persons. In addition to having produced these new recommendations through the consultative process mentioned before, as an expert group under the UN Statistical Commission, we also have a broader mandate that looks to support and promote their implementation. So in three main ways, we are, in a kind of forward-looking sense, aiming to do this with the IROSS. In very much an ongoing and current sense, we're already doing this with the refugee recommendations and the IDP recommendations that perhaps I'll have a moment to mention later on. Firstly, we are working very actively to promote the new set of recommendations, to make them accessible to the right people in the right organizations in the right countries. That itself takes quite a lot of effort and coordination. Secondly, we're hoping to, and we will continue to provide a platform for stakeholders, and I say broadly stakeholders, but in particular, I'm thinking here of national statistical officers and other representatives from national authorities are working on this topic, to share their experiences, to share their lesson learned, because we believe this is the most effective way to build momentum and overcome or perhaps minimize common challenges that countries may face. And thirdly, we hoping to secure further resources to make it possible to invest further in capacity development. Because what we hear from countries and the guidance we received also from the Statistical Commission when the IROSS were up for consideration was, this is great, but capacity development is required in many of the contexts where these could have an impact. So we're also kind of actively, building on our existing working group within EGRISS who focus on the topic of capacity development at regional and national level, to also kind of embrace statelessness into the scope of their work in the coming years. All three of these avenues will be informed by our efforts, as mentioned previously, to support the implementation of the international statistical recommendations on refugees and on internally displaced persons. That we've been doing through, for example, regional workshops, development of e-learning, further technical guidance, translating the materials into relevant languages, to make these global recommendations more accessible to, as I say, the right people in the right organizations in the right countries. Recognizing that there are particularities when it comes to statelessness as compared to refugees or IDPs, or in this regard, other vulnerable groups that are too often left out of national statistics. One of our key priorities since the IROSS were endorsed earlier this year is to really work actively with our existing membership. Currently 55 countries are members of EGRISS, and our steering committee members, to devise an effective plan and think about very concretely how we can support the implementation of IROSS for the next few years. And in closing, let me say, if there is anyone here in this session, in person or online, who would like to get involved, EGRISS membership is always open to new countries and other organizations who'd like to take part in this effort. So please do be in touch. Let me leave it there, Maya, and looking forward to further questions if you have any for me.
Great, thanks, Natalia. And this was super important, right? The expert group has really been super active over the past years, and we've seen the production of tools that are extremely helpful for the collection of data on vulnerable populations. So it's really good to hear you on this, Natalia, and also to understand what tools at hand we have. Now, I'm conscious that we have 5 minutes left, and in this I need to cram in a couple of more things. So I'm going to ask all three panelists to be extremely brief. I'm going to get a question each. You maybe confine yourself to one comment or one example, but really briefly. We're talking 30 to 60 seconds, and then I will wrap up this session. And yes, indeed, let's get you all up on the screen. Super. So Maritza, I want to take it back to you. What essential capacity development needs are required to support you to implement the statistical standards, the recommendations that we're mentioning, if you were to go forward with that, provided you confirm that nationally and so forth?
Okay. The PSA has already been part of the EGRISS, and of course we fully support for the implementation of the recommendation. But as I mentioned a while ago, we're currently reviewing the recommendation on how we can adapt it under the Philippine setting. So what are the capacity development required? I think we need capacity building for the technical staff for training on the IROSS. Maybe we can consider also the IRRS and the IRIS, since there are many items or variables needed based on the recommendation. The census cover. The census gathering is a large operation and it would involve additional costs if we are to take all of this, or maybe consider reviewing under the Philippine setting what are some of the data required as for the IROSS. And although some of our census team, the population team, has already attended the e-learning, we want to fully understand on how we can, implement. So I think that is needed. Um, but of course, I am not committing the PSA.
No,
It
no.
is, of course, our NS. But basically, I think we need that, and support also for trainings for the enumerators, because this is the first time that we will uh, ever, if ever, we will conduct additional information to capture on statelessness. So that is being also discussed with our OIC Deputy National Statistician, the support needed for the technical staff and review of the IROS recommendation under the Philippine setting. Thank you very much.
Super. And you know what, Maritza? This is straight to Natalia. Natalia, what is your advice to Maritza on these capacity issues? 1, 2.
Right, sorry, finding my my microphone button. It's Maritza who advises me. So in Maritza and her and so many of her peers in our group. So allow me to generalize the question and to say, kind of key recommendations to other countries that I hear in my role in the Secretariat. I would say 3 things are really critical. The first is political will is essential. So find the right hook in your national context, whether that is, the relevant policy framework or otherwise. We hear this loud and clear from Rwanda in recent discussions. Clear roles and responsibilities. Take time to identify them. I've heard this from Maritza in today and in many other occasions. Dedicated coordination resources for this effort. It involves so many different stakeholders. That's really important in a very practical sense. And thirdly, making informed decisions. So do the work that Maritza is highlighting, mapping out, familiarizing yourselves with recommendations, mapping out those opportunities, looking at existing data, but also look at upcoming opportunities in a particular context. So, capacity is one thing, but taking it a bit larger, we look at these other elements and we really see these as indicators of success in other countries. And whilst I have the floor, let me just say one last final thing from a global perspective in the context of the World Data Forum and, of course, the broader progress we're all making, or in some cases not making, towards the Sustainable Development Goals. The huge demands that are put on countries when we're talking about vulnerable populations, countries that already are not in necessarily a place to produce some of the basic statistics required for this monitoring of developmental progress. We can't shy away from the fact that specific resources are needed to support these additional data demands in so many contexts. So I would really like to just highlight that, since I have the floor for 5 more seconds, that, really financial resources, and to the donors at the UN World Data Forum kind of thinking about how to target their limited resources in this field. It is really important to think about some of these vulnerable populations in that context. So thank you, Maya, over to you.
Thank you, Natalia. And so I will kindly ask the organizers to give us extra 2 minutes, and then we will wrap up. But because I just want to hear Monica on one last bit, which is a pitch, a call for action. So Monica, the Global Refugee Forum is happening in December 2023, so this year. What opportunity do we have here if we sort of zoom out and look at all the stakeholders under the Refugee Forum?
Thanks, Maya, for that. I think the 2 things. We are establishing a global alliance to end statelessness. So that's where we are looking for member states, international organizations, regional organizations to join the global alliance. It will be launched in the end of 2024. But the GRF is already an opportunity to pledge around that you want to join the global alliance. And then specifically regarding IROSS, you can also make a pledge regarding implementation of IROSS. That's one of the suggestions we've made, and we hope that we will see many pledges around that. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Monica. So before thanking all the panelists, let me just quickly run through a couple of takeaways from this session, which I think it would be worth our while. We were talking about the world's most vulnerable people, those without a nationality, and some real data challenges that are affecting them, both in terms of the numbers of them and the socioeconomic situation. It's super encouraging to see that there are notable examples of improving statelessness data in different regions and in national context. And we want to have that trend continue, because this is fundamental to the protection of this marginalized population. And here, the sort of range of different data sources and approaches are essential. From what we heard today, I think we can be encouraged that the new statistical recommendations will serve as that important key tool to support country efforts to improve national data on stateless persons, and that EGRISS will continue to be an important platform to mobilize these efforts. Data is essential for policymaking. However, collecting data is expensive, as we heard. It's not easy to secure resources for all the needs and priorities in national statistical work. The importance of collecting data on stateless population therefore requires recognition and some dedication of resources so that it does not fall off the radar in competition with other areas. So it's really important that we also muster international financial support to include stateless people in national statistical systems. And lastly, I just want to echo Monica's call for pledges in the build-up to the Global Refugee Forum this year. The inclusion of stateless in national statistics is a key goal. And let's continue the momentum on data and statistics on statelessness through the action of a critical mass of countries, development, and humanitarian actors. So, with the large amount of work that has been conducted by colleagues in different countries and by international organizations to finalize the recommendations, we've reached, again, this important milestone. And as a core financial and technical contributor to EGRISS and its work on statelessness, we at the Joint Data Center are really heartened by the efforts of this group and remain thoroughly committed to support as we march on. There's a clear momentum, and let's seize it and capitalize on it together with all the national statistical offices who are engaged in EGRISS. So thank you to all the panelists, the presenters, for their insightful and important contributions to this discussion. And thank you in the audience, both in person and online, for your careful attention to this topic. Thank you very much. And maybe, excuse me, maybe one last thing. There's another session going on Thursday at 2:30 in room 3, where we're going to talk about inclusion of IDPs, internally displaced, and refugees. You might want to come and listen to that as well. Thank you very much.